Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou katoa, and welcome to this panel discussion entitled Killing for Conservation. Such an ugly word, killing, isn't it? I mean, we tend to talk about control, culling, eradication even, but it all comes down to depriving something of life. In New Zealand, we have a social license to kill certain things with impunity, right? Rats and stoats and possums and ferrets and weasels. We all know people incapable of killing a chicken, yet completely blithe about running over a possum or whacking a rat. But it's been found that possums have a rich social and intellectual life with means of communication to convey emotions, happiness, love, grief. No, that's whales, sorry. But if it were true of possums, would that make a difference? Or does the damage they and other predators cause to things we choose to value more highly put them on death row with no appeal? There are assumptions made in the Predator-Free New Zealand project, offshore islands and a few onshore islands, Zealandia. What's not to like? They're one thing, but the whole country purged because we don't like the habits of stoats, and besides they all look like Vladimir Putin. What sort of people are we, as Wayne Linklater might ask? It's these kind of issues that our panel's been wrestling with. They're all members of the 12-person Bioethics Panel, part of the Biological Heritage National Science Challenge, working on a strategy for Predator-Free New Zealand 2050. Let me briefly introduce them. I'm sure they're known to many of you. Dr. Macdonald, a psychologist who's managing social policy for the Department of Conservation. Professor James Maclaurin, an applied philosopher at the University of Otago. Dr. Cilla Wehi, cultural ecologist, conservation biologist at Manaki Whenua, or Land Care Research. And Professor Doug Armstrong, with expertise in wildlife management and conservation. He's from Mass University. Please welcome them. I wanted to start with you, Edie, because you were telling me about some interesting survey figures. And the survey picture of New Zealanders' attitudes to predator-free is quite a complex one.
Yes, most definitely. So we've done some research on behalf of the National Science Challenge, and we found that New Zealanders, about 85% of them, understand and are aware that pests are a problem for New Zealand wildlife and our biodiversity. But that's where the consensus stops. So about a third of New Zealanders don't like killing and see sanctity in all life. That is, they value the introduced species as well as the native species. And for them, it's a real problem with moving things forward with current methodologies. They do not like the idea of killing, and their preference is for a lot more planting and non-lethal techniques.
So they think, I mean, I don't know whether you drill down into those results. Do they think that there's coexistence possible with predators and the native species?
So we've just finished up some focus groups and we're still analyzing the data, but one of the aspects that came out quite strongly was those pest species, and I use that term, didn't come here willingly, and therefore they have a right to coexist and live. And so they don't see the need to kill them, to give them a death warrant, to use some people's words.
Because everything changes and nature evolves like everything else and we can't freeze it.
Yes, and so they don't see this vilification of rats and stoats. That's their value system, and we need to work with that value system as we move things forward for greater biodiversity gains.
Do you think, James, as a philosopher, it's been necessary for us to vilify weasels and possums in order to kill them?
I think it's necessary for us to have views about the value of the species with which we coexist. So we use many of them provide ecosystem services to us, many of them are valuable for agricultural purposes. So obviously we naturally place values on the species that are around us, synanthropes that we see all the time, pets, all this sort of thing. So you might just think that this is the converse of that. So there are some species that we disvalue precisely because they're not things that we want. They make it harder to achieve the goals that we have, and those goals might just be psychological or social or cultural goals. They make it harder for us to achieve the economic goals, the tourist goals, all those sorts of things that we want. So inevitably, there are going to be species that we disvalue, and those species are ones that we want fewer of.
Is there a word that is the same as xenophobia when we apply it to people, for animals? Because that's what we've done, right? We've vilified possums and weasels and stoats and rats and made them horrible so that we don't mind killing them.
I don't know if it's xenophobia. So actually, I have a graduate student at the moment who's working on species charisma. So we really do love some sorts of animals, you know, whales and giraffes and anything that's cute, those sorts of things. So there's that dimension, if you like, and that influences funding and taxonomic effort and all that sort of thing. Xenophobia, I think, is another thing. I mean, yes, in a way, species charisma is a sort of a rationality that we have. I don't know if it's irrational to dislike species that are wiping out native birds, that are making New Zealand into a place that you know, lacks a certain richness that we love.
Well, makes New Zealand into a place that is different from what it was.
Yes?
That's a value judgment in itself, right?
Sure. I mean,
we have some utopian idea of the way New Zealand used to be. Is that what we're trying to get back to?
I don't think that's what we're trying to get back to, but coming back to James' point about values, particularly biologists and a lot of people especially from other countries as well, they recognize New Zealand's this very isolated landmass, and much like the Galapagos Islands and stuff, so it has this, you know, treasures of internationally unique biodiversity, and then locally, of course, are regarded as Tonga as well. So I think people can place high value on those things without necessarily being unrealistic and saying, yes, we're going to try to get back to, you know, the way things were before humans arrived. I don't think anyone seriously has ever says we really want to get things back before the way.
There is that
before
suspicion,
humans
though.
arrived.
There's that suspicion that we have a kind of utopian desire, which is misanthropic at the same time. You know, we've ruined everything, and we want to try to repair the damage. Don't you think? What do you think, Cilla?
I want to reframe it in a completely different way.
I thought you might.
Actually. Yeah, but first I'd just like to say kia ora to everybody who came tonight. He mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Thank you all so much for coming. I'd like to sort of think of it in a different way. So going back to the treaty. So, you know, as soon as I go back to the treaty, everyone thinks I'm pouring a bit of cold water here, because what I'm going to talk about is that we're committed to an equal partnership. When we're committed to an equal partnership, that means sometimes giving up power, but it also means that we've got shared responsibility. And I think when it comes to an initiative like Predator Free 2050, that is an absolutely fantastic thing. So shared responsibility is great, but what it also means is then we have to think about other people's points of view. So if I said to you, the research tells us that when we lose biodiversity, we also lose culture and we lose language. So losing biodiversity is not a trivial thing.
Can you expand on that? Why?
So, if, for example, I was going out to harvest a species in the forest, there would be a whole lot of words, a whole lot of language around the practices that I'm engaged in my relationship. So it's all about relationship and connection. So if I stop doing those practices, then those words become unfamiliar, that part of the language, that part of my practice also becomes lost along with the species.
What do you want to harvest in the forest, by the way?
That's a great topic for shared discussion, Kim.
Yeah.
So I think that loss of biodiversity is actually a shared value. That's also what Edie's research is saying. But if we want to have a conversation about how we go about that, then there might be a whole lot of different points of view. Yeah, but I don't think it's about utopia. I think it's about the relationships that everybody here has got with different aspects of our biodiversity. I bet there's not a single person here who would put up their hand if I said, who here doesn't have a relationship with a species in New Zealand, a native species?
What does a relationship mean, though, Cilla?
Oh, look, that's philosophy. That's philosophy, go.
The ball's in your court.
So I think relationship is so vague, so it's not surprising that nobody in the room would put their hand up. If you just mean that we know of one, or we're influenced by one, or we like one. How about that? Who here doesn't have a native species that they like, that they care about?
Well, nobody's going to be brave enough to put their hand up to that. Put it the other way, who does have a native species that they would lie down on the railway tracks for? Well, there's a fairly decent show of hands.
Excellent. Is there a train coming?
No.